All right, so my computer actually shut me down at the end of the part 1 of this lecture on reading 14. I was just about to refer you to the last paragraph before the essay, Digging Deeper, What Do We Do with Pink Boys? So let's look at it. It reads, we can see from this cross-cultural survey of third genders that it's primarily males who are being accommodated. So males who are effeminate, bisexual, gay, or otherwise transgendered will often have a meaningful cultural space they can occupy, but as is noted, females are not so accommodated, and that's simply because cultures are all patriarchal. Is the short answer to that question. A patriarchy is a male-centered, male-dominated, male-defined social system, and all cultures, at least to some extent, are patriarchal. Okay, the Digging Deeper essays, what do we do with pink boys? This is an interesting essay on little boys as early as age 2 who are exhibiting, let's say, cross-gender behavior or transgendered behavior. They are acting in ways that we would ideally determine as feminine in our culture. And so we have this term pink boys. I guess a derogatory term for that would be sissy. I described them in the very first paragraph there. They're little boys, male children who wear dresses, like to wear dresses and play with dolls, although they may not necessarily identify themselves as girls. And we've always had such individuals around. But we have always ignored them, or as I said, belittled them, or tried to put them down or hide them. Today we recognize them. It's a legitimate cultural phenomenon. Look at the bottom of the third paragraph. The author of this article is Padawar. I write, Padawar notes that some of the pink boys eventually grow out of their transgenderism and assume male roles, although the majority of them eventually become gay adults. So what we have here, at least in the boys, is that what is gender atypicality at a young age, in the majority of cases, ends up being same-sex sexual attraction as adults. That's important. Keep that idea in mind. Look at the next paragraph, where I do discuss that link between gender atypicality and same-sex sexual orientation in adults. And that was commented on in the paper by Pillard and Bailey. Last sentence of that paragraph is important too. A comprehensive Dutch study of over 20,000 male and female twins, and that's a huge sample size, age 7 and 10, reported that genetics can account for 70% of transgender behavior. In other words, about 70% of the reasons why a person is transgendered can be attributed to genetics. A strong argument for the genetic component to gender atypicality. And since that leads, more often than not, to same-sex sexual attraction, we have an obvious genetic link to both. Next paragraph, it's noted, well, 2 paragraphs down, it's noted that the author, Padawar, reports that referrals to gender clinics are 7 times higher for boys than for girls. Well, to be quite honest, our society has never been concerned about tomboys. In fact, your typical father would be proud of their little girl mixing it up in the backyard playing tackle football with little boys, but would be actually ashamed of a little boy at the very same age doing the very same thing, namely playing with other little girls, playing with dolls, playing tea party or whatever the heck they do, right? So there's an obvious double standard, even though consider the fact that both of those things are precisely culturally equivalent. but nevertheless one is looked down upon and one is almost embraced. At the next paragraph, I do try to explain why that's the case. So why are tomboys okay, but quote-unquote pink boys or sissies are not? So read with me. There are two related issues here. First, patriarchy has established the social superiority of maleness. It's a privileged status with such a strong cultural bias attached to it that anyone, even females, are welcomed as long as the fundamental characteristics are not altered. So yes, it's true that the world has had capable female leaders like female prime ministers and so forth, but virtually all have adopted what are considered to be male characteristics like competitiveness, belligerent stoicism, and they were rewarded with positions of authority. So that's one point. So in other words, yes, you can come over here in this what I call patriarchal space, but there are rules and you have to follow them. If you do, we're good. Tomboys follow those rules, if that makes any sense. Second, continue reading, given the social ascendancy of maleness and masculinity, which are the cultural standards, the fundamental tenets and practices of patriarchy are closely guarded and policed. Thus, those behaviors or notions that challenge the fundamental premises of patriarchy, for example, males who are effeminate, are not socially tolerated. So for a male to move outside this patriarchal space, that's considered to be anathema to culture in general, especially to patriarchy. So it's all about maintaining the integrity of the patriarchal space. Now, if there's a question that comes up along those lines, that's not a bad way to start it, but of course you need to explain what that means. But it comes down to maintaining the integrity of patriarchal space. Okay, Chapter 11, Section 4, Misogyny and the Abuses of Patriarchy. There are many. In fact, I teach a course now, The Anthropology of Gender, Patriarchy, and Sexuality, where we spend over a month simply talking about the many abuses of patriarchy that exist around the world. Misogyny, by the way, is a hatred or mistreatment of women. The last sentence in that first paragraph, misogyny is common in our world and seems destined to stay that way, given the fact that no systemic changes in patriarchal ideologies seem imminent. I'm going to say a little bit more on that later. What about the cultural origins of misogyny? How did we get to this point where women are at best second-class citizens? And remember, you guys are living in the world of 2020. You can't imagine what it was like even 60, 70 years ago. Look at the first paragraph, the bottom sentence. This brings us to perhaps the most crucial aspect of the social division of labor in regard to the ascendancy of patriarchy. Namely, for strictly biological reasons, females are burdened with childbearing, which translates to child rearing as well, even though it is true that males are just as capable of that activity as females. The point I'm making here is that no matter how society has changed, from hunting and gathering to a more sedentary, trade-oriented society, females have always been burdened with domesticity, right? The raising and the bearing and raising of children. And for that reason, males could engage in all kinds of activities like trade, warfare, government, and so forth that females could not. Now, look at that next paragraph. I'm going to advise you to block out that entire paragraph. It starts as societies grew more dense and more structured. Well, here I basically run down sort of the steps that take us from ancient times to today. And everything changed, by the way, with the Neolithic period, roughly call it 10,000 years ago. And that's when people began to engage in plant and animal domestication, like growing crops, herding animals, which allowed for a more settled existence, which allowed for dense settlements, which of course led to trade, the development of classes, warfare. Don't forget though, however, females, their role never changed. They're still burdened with bearing children and raising children. I do note that once the earliest groups began to write down their myths, they were patriarchal. So actually, if you go back before the Neolithic period, in other words, pre-10,000 years ago, we, in some parts of the world, we have what's called the Age of the Goddess, where females were revered as being the focus of fertility, of springtime renewal, fecundity, and all those things. People were almost in awe of females. In fact, some people considered God to be feminine. But that all went by the wayside when the Neolithic period began. And then once writing was invented, about 3500 BCE, unfortunately, people began to put down these patriarchal myths in writing. And so all of these stories generated by men, by the way, all the scriptures of all the world's religions were written by men. The women's voice is silent. They, in fact, were not allowed to speak, and certainly not allowed to write. But unfortunately, by the time humans discovered writing, patriarchy was already entrenched. And so we get these highly patriarchal religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and I talk a little bit about that there. Another important thing to look at here is paternity anxiety, and that's simply the idea that the mother, of course, always knows she's the mother, but the father never can know for 100% certainty that he is the father. And that is such an issue that in some cultures, men manifest certain symptoms of pregnancy called kuvad. Find that word, C-O-U-V-A-D-E. And obviously that's a manifestation of this anxiety. Men, at least subconsciously, trying to show that yes, they are the father. Now keep that paternity anxiety in mind, because it has a lot to do with men trying to control women. The next section is on the abuses of patriarchy. The first sentence, this concern with paternity has led to a number of misogynistic practices cross-culturally that all have one primary function, and that is to guard the property rights of males in regard to their women and to protect the virginal status of their women, thus ensuring paternity. Perhaps the most egregious example of the control men have over women is infibulation in the next paragraph. This is the most brutal form of female genital mutilation, FGM. And you can read the details there. They're pretty gruesome, but they actually excise whole parts of the vagina and sew it back together in an attempt to actually control access to women's vaginas. It's very blatant in this case. About partway through that paragraph, towards the bottom, there's a sentence, given what we know about the history of patriarchy and the abuses of patriarchy, it's clear that infibulation is simply a blatant attempt on the part of males to control their access to virginity. I talk a little bit about, to move ahead to the Middle Ages, about the 15th century is when the Malleus Maleficarum was written. Now remember, we're talking about patriarchy and the abuses of patriarchy here, and misogyny, and all these things were rampant in the Malleus Maleficarum. And as you read there, it was basically a Bible, quote unquote, for witch hunters, written by the Catholic Church. And you can read some excerpts there, but it's almost comical today when you read it, but you can read the excerpts, and it's all online, by the way, if you want to check it out. But just looking at the excerpts I have, women were, quote unquote, a necessary evil. They were, quote unquote, carnal abominations. They were wicked, so forth and so on. So that just gives you a little snapshot of how people were thinking about women, even as late as the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, as you read there, anywhere from 60 to 100,000 people were put to death for the fictional crime of witchcraft. Of course, there are no witches. It's basically hysteria. And actually, that number, 80%, I've adjusted that. That's more like 85% today, based on the latest writings that I've seen were actually females, many of them elderly females. A couple of paragraphs down, I talk about sati, which is an Indian abuse of patriarchy. Indians, of course, cremate their dead, and when a man was cremated, at least, let's say, in ancient times, women were expected to throw themselves on the funeral pyre and immolate themselves. Because according to Indian society, widows are basically useless. And there's a paragraph on that where I'm quoting Ahmad. You can find that quote there. Traditionally, the unfortunate women who could not commit or were prevented from committing sati were doomed to lead the most austere life. As a widow, a woman is devoid of reason to adorn herself. If she follows tradition, she may shave her head, shed her jewelry, wear only plain white or dark clothing, and eat a single meal, and are sent to live the rest of their lives in economic, familial, and romantic deprivation following their husbands' deaths. Their presence at family functions was totally forbidden. The widows lived in joint families, died unwept and unsung. Women in India are always under the thumb of some male, be it their father, their husband, or their sons. And so the notion of sati says a lot about how women were thought of in Indian society. And then a little bit further down, I do mention domestic abuse in this country, which by the way, is still epidemic. You don't hear about it much. We almost take it as something for granted today, which is really sad and pathetic in a kind of way. And if you do some reading on this, which I have, it's noted here that while we have dragged our feet here, we've just birthed a new generation of domestic abusers because the numbers don't appear to be getting any better. By the way, the number one cause of physical injury to women in this country, domestic abuse. 1 in 3 women that are murdered by a significant other, a partner of some sort. Well, there is one movement, and only one, that exists today that is fighting back, and it's called feminism. I would suggest that you forget everything you have heard about feminism, because I'm guessing unless you've really done some good reading on from some good sources, what you know is a little bit better than nonsense, because that's what you're going to get in the popular media, especially, good Lord, online, where it's just rampant with misinformation. First of all, please understand, it should be pretty obvious why so many, especially those on the right side of the political spectrum, what we call conservatives and so forth, have a problem with feminism. It's because feminism is challenging patriarchy. And it's the only game in town, as I said. So of course they're threatened by it. So always keep that in mind. First paragraph, I'm addressing the idea that some people say that, you know what, I'm nearing 20 minutes here, so I'm going to stop it right there, and I'm going to pick up that thought in part 3.